When Karen initiated a ban preventing my nephew from accessing the community pool, I didn't even possess knowledge of her name. Half a year later, I was familiar with her bank account details and her complete history of corruption. This evolution from an oblivious neighbor into a forensic investigator occurred because Karen Mitchell committed a single, crucial error. She chose to engage in a conflict with a retired construction lawyer who had dedicated 20 years to dismantling fraud schemes and had nothing left to fear after the loss of his wife. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. I found myself standing in my own doorway, clad in a bathrobe with steam wafting from my coffee cup, confronting two bewildered police officers and one exceptionally smug woman dressed in tennis attire. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with Karen's potent vanilla perfume should have been my initial sign that this situation was no longer merely about the pool regulations. One has to wonder how they would respond if an HOA figure like Karen attempted to turn the police against them, a situation that unfortunately plays out for many dealing with their own neighborhood despots. My name is Dave Martinez, and just 8 months prior, I believed I was relocating to paradise. Willowbrook Estates was comprised of 127 immaculate homes constructed between 2019 and 2021, featuring a $400,000 community pool that shimmered like a precious stone in the morning light. I paid a premium for the corner property that offered a view of the pool, shelling out $750,000 when similar houses were selling for $650,000. It was worth every single penny, or so I thought, particularly after witnessing my wife Sarah's 3-year struggle with cancer. Sarah passed away last October. The home we had lived in for 22 years suddenly felt like a mausoleum filled with memories. Consequently, I packed my belongings and relocated to Willowbrook for a fresh start. Having retired from construction law after 2 decades of combating contractor fraud, I imagined I had earned a measure of peace and quiet. Each morning, I would take a seat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, observing the sunrise as it reflected on the pool's surface and listening to the early swimmers as their rhythmic strokes sliced through the water. It was a form of moving meditation, precisely what my grief therapist had advised. That was when she first came to my attention. Karen Mitchell, age 48, a real estate agent, the HOA vice president, and the proprietor of the model home that served as the anchor for our small community. She was perpetually clad in designer athletic wear, her blonde highlights flawlessly kept, and she carried that infernal binder with her everywhere, as though she were managing a Fortune 500 corporation rather than a suburban homeowners association. Her marriage to City Councilman Brad Mitchell meant she was acquainted with all the influential people, a fact she never allowed anyone to forget. The initial few months were wonderfully free of Karen. I minded my own business, adhered to every regulation meticulously, and gradually began to feel like a person again. Then summer made its entrance, and along with it came my nephew, Miguel. Miguel is 16, my brother's son from Phoenix. He is exceptionally intelligent, bound for engineering school in the autumn, and the nearest thing to a son I will ever have. Sarah and I never had children. We were too preoccupied with our careers, and later, too consumed by her medical treatments. Miguel was living with me for the summer, employed at the local hardware store and providing company for his old uncle. The problems began on a Tuesday in June. Miguel had asked 2 friends from his summer job to join him for a day at the pool. They were good kids, respectful, the type who genuinely say, "Thank you, Mr. Martinez," without needing to be told. We are talking about roughly 90 minutes of teenage laughter and the occasional splash. It was then that Karen materialized at the poolside, clipboard in hand, resembling some sort of HOA Grim Reaper. The scent of chlorine blended with her overpowering vanilla perfume, forming a sickening cloud as she neared our small gathering. "Excuse me," she stated, loudly enough for the entire pool area to overhear. "I need to inspect the guest passes for these young men." Guest passes. I had been a resident for 8 months and had never been informed about any guest passes. "They are family," I clarified, maintaining an even tone. "This is Miguel, my nephew, and these are his friends from his job." Karen's smile was so sharp it could have shattered glass. "Rules are rules, Mr. Martinez. The HOA bylaws are explicit that excessive guest usage, which is defined as more than 2 guests per household in a week, necessitates pre-registration and approved guest passes. I proposed registering the boys as extended guests, which seemed a perfectly sensible solution, but Karen had no interest in being sensible. "No exceptions," she pronounced, referencing her clipboard as if it held the 10 Commandments. "Pool privileges are hereby suspended for Lot 47, pending a compliance review." The creaking of pool chairs was audible as other residents suddenly became engrossed in their phones. The stale scent of fear was palpable. No one wished to become Karen's subsequent target. Miguel and his friends silently collected their towels, feeling both embarrassed and bewildered. That evening, Karen put up an official notification on the community bulletin board. "Pool privileges suspended for Lot 47 pending compliance review." She even made a declaration at the weekly HOA meeting, highlighting my failure to follow established protocols, with just enough theatrical dismay to clearly designate who the villain was meant to be. As I sat in that basement community center, encircled by anxious neighbors and the smell of stale coffee, I came to the conclusion that this was not about pool regulations. It was about power, dominance, and putting the new resident in his place. Karen had just made her initial error. She had initiated a conflict with an individual who had dedicated 20 years to confronting bullies who concealed themselves behind contracts and fine print. It was time to revive some old skills. Karen did not delay in escalating the situation. 3 days following the pool incident, I discovered a formal letter in my mailbox, sent via certified mail, no less. She had arranged a compliance hearing with the HOA board, providing me with a mere 48 hours of notice. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 7 p.m. Thursday was Sarah's birthday. My plan had been to visit her grave, perhaps with the sunflowers she cherished, and spend some quiet moments speaking to her about Miguel and how proud she would be of the young man he was becoming. The letter listed several violations I had supposedly committed. Trash cans visible from the street, which they were not. Lawn height exceeding 3.5 inches, though I had measured it myself at 3.2. And my absolute favorite, failure to maintain community harmony through appropriate guest management. That evening, I did what any competent lawyer does when confronted by an antagonistic opponent. I scrutinized the fine print. I read every single page of the HOA documents I had endorsed at closing, along with the original community charter. 20 years in construction law teaches you that the devil resides in the details, and Karen had just provided me with a guide to her vulnerabilities. Concealed on page 47 of the charter, I struck gold. Reasonable accommodation shall be provided for family gatherings and multi-generational household activities. Karen's guest policy was in direct contradiction to the very foundational document she professed to be upholding. Even more advantageously, her formal letter breached at least 3 procedural rules: an inadequate notice period, a failure to name the specific bylaw that was purportedly violated, and scheduling during what any rational person would deem a time of family emergency. On Thursday evening, I entered Karen's dining room. As it appeared we were now conducting official HOA matters in her private home, clutching a manila folder with all pertinent documents highlighted and tabbed. The scent of her lavender air freshener was so potent that I began to suspect she was attempting to mask something else. Perhaps the stench of corruption has its own distinct odor. The board members seemed uneasy. Jim Walsh, the president and a newly retired high school teacher, kept fidgeting in his seat. Maria Santos, our treasurer and a pragmatic accountant, was jotting down notes with the focus of someone gathering evidence. Karen's husband, Brad, was absent, likely wise enough to preserve plausible deniability. Karen began with a PowerPoint presentation. I am not exaggerating. She had prepared actual slides concerning the maintenance of community standards and the protection of property values. Every third slide contained a thinly disguised jab at certain residents who failed to grasp our way of life. The sound of her manicured fingernails tapping on the mahogany table created an annoying cadence that mirrored her condescending delivery. When she concluded her performance, I calmly rose and started to arrange my documents. "Before we continue," I stated, "I would like to address several procedural breaches in tonight's hearing. Firstly, HOA business cannot be held in a board member's private home without prior community notification. Secondly, the 48-hour notice period is a violation of our bylaws, which mandate a minimum of 7 days' notice for compliance hearings. Thirdly, the supposed violations mentioned in your letter do not align with any specific bylaw text." Jim Walsh's interest was piqued. Dave, are you implying this hearing is illegitimate? I am implying, I responded, that if we intend to enforce rules, we ought to perhaps adhere to them ourselves. I opened my folder and extracted the highlighted pages of the charter. In accordance with the foundational document we all consented to, and I quote, reasonable accommodation shall be provided for family gatherings and multi-generational household activities. My nephew's day at the pool with two friends is squarely covered by this provision. Karen's face turned red. That phrasing is obsolete. We have since updated. With all due respect, Karen, I interjected, the original charter can only be amended by a community-wide vote. Has such a vote taken place? There was only silence. Maria Santos glanced up from her notes and shook her head. This is where Karen made her most critical mistake. Rather than admitting to the procedural flaws and arranging a proper hearing, she resorted to a personal attack. Perhaps Mr. Martinez is struggling to adapt to community life following his recent loss. Maybe the strain of learning new rules is proving to be too much. The room fell deathly silent. Even Karen's allies seemed uncomfortable. The sound of the air conditioning unit cycling on in the distance was audible. I gathered my documents with slow deliberation. Thank you all for your time. I will be conducting a more thorough review of our community charter and will be in contact. The vote was 4-2 to maintain the pool ban, with Jim Walsh and Maria Santos as the dissenters. However, a change had occurred. Karen had shown her true nature, and the board had caught a glimpse of what they were truly up against. That night, I opened my laptop and commenced the kind of in-depth research I hadn't undertaken since my last significant construction fraud investigation. I examined HOA formation documents, municipal records, and Karen's real estate transaction history. It was all public information if one knew where to search. By 2 a.m., I had discovered the initial threat. Karen Mitchell Realty had served as the exclusive sales agent during Willowbrook's construction. Such exclusive deals typically involve incentives. It was time to determine precisely what those incentives had entailed. Karen's subsequent action came more swiftly than I anticipated. In less than a week, she had established what she termed a neighborhood watch patrol. This consisted of 3 residents armed with clipboards and cameras who recorded every minor infraction of HOA rules throughout the community. All of a sudden, people were receiving violation notices for issues that had been overlooked for years. Basketball hoops stored inside garages, but visible through windows, garden gnomes that surpassed the 2-decoration limit, and Christmas lights still displayed in July. However, I was receiving particular focus. There were daily drive-bys, photos of my property taken from various angles, and printed warnings tucked under the windshield wipers of anyone who came to visit me. Miguel began to jest that Karen was stalking us, but I could tell it was starting to affect him. A 16-year-old should not have to be concerned about causing trouble for his uncle simply by being present. The campaign of harassment was also having its desired impact on the community. Fear was spreading like a contagion. Neighbors who once waved from their driveways now found their phones incredibly interesting whenever I walked past. The rift was becoming apparent. Newer residents sided with Karen's standards, while the original homeowners expressed their worries in whispers in supermarket aisles. It was then that Maria Santos approached me after one of my morning strolls. She is a petite woman with a spine of steel, the type of accountant who could detect a financial anomaly from 3 counties away. Dave, she said in a low voice, glancing around as if we were plotting a covert operation, we need to have a conversation. There are aspects of this HOA's finances that are not adding up. While Karen was preoccupied with playing security officer, I was engaged in what construction lawyers excel at, tracing the money. I had set up discrete security cameras around my property, which is perfectly lawful in Texas, incidentally, and started to record Karen's patrol times. Every drive-by, every photograph, and every act of intimidation was time-stamped and documented. Here is a legal insight that most people are unaware of. HOA enforcement actions must be preceded by written warnings before any penalties can be levied. Karen's verbal harassment and prompt pool ban were in violation of due process rights as stipulated by state law. A key takeaway is to document everything, as HOA board members can be held accountable for procedural breaches. I also began to quietly form connections with Jim Walsh and Maria Santos. It became clear that I was not the first resident to be subjected to Karen's particular style of community leadership. Jim recounted tales of families who had moved out rather than tolerate her harassment. Maria alluded to financial discrepancies but required more time to gather proof. The pool incident that altered everything unfolded on a Friday afternoon. Miguel and his friends had waited for the designated family hours to use the pool, following all the rules. They were peacefully enjoying the water when Karen arrived with her clipboard and 2 patrol volunteers, resembling some sort of HOA Special Forces unit. "Exit the pool at once," she declared, her voice resonating across the water. "Lot 47 is still under suspension of pool privileges." The boys complied without protest. Miguel had instructed them well on avoiding escalations. However, Karen was not content with their obedience. She trailed them to my house, with her group in tow, her voice growing louder with every step. By the time they arrived at my driveway, half the neighborhood was observing from their windows. Karen was in full theatrical display, gesticulating wildly and speaking about certain types of people who don't understand community standards. It was at this point that my legal expertise became crucial. Rather than getting into a shouting contest, I took out my phone and began to record. "Karen," I said calmly, "the HOA has a legal duty to ensure equal access to community facilities for all residents in good standing. Can you please reference the specific bylaw that supports the ongoing suspension of pool privileges?" She continued her tirade, but now she was being recorded. "This is about more than just pool rules, Mr. Martinez. This is about individuals who align with our community's values and those who do not." 3 neighbors came out of their houses, visibly troubled by Karen's tone and the meaning behind her words. Mrs. Chun from the opposite side of the street shook her head in disapproval. The Johnsons, a young black couple who had recently moved in, shared a knowing glance. "If you are unable to manage your guests," Karen went on, unaware of the expanding audience, "perhaps this community is not the right place for you." I sent the recording to the HOA board via email that evening, along with a formal complaint detailing harassment and discriminatory enforcement. The email was professional, thorough, and chronicled Karen's pattern of behavior with timestamps and witness statements. An emergency board meeting was convened for the following Tuesday. Karen's defense was what one would expect. She claimed she was safeguarding the community from external threats and risks to property values. When the vote on a formal censure was taken, it resulted in a 3-3 tie, with Karen abstaining. No action was taken. Yet, a significant change had occurred. After the meeting, Maria Santos handed me a manila envelope. "Financial records," she whispered. "Compare the construction contracts to the actual amenity expenses. Then let me know your thoughts." That night, I laid those documents out on my dining room table and experienced the familiar excitement of identifying the inconsistencies that would bring everything to light. The figures presented a narrative that Karen most certainly did not want anyone to discover. Karen's subsequent action was her ultimate resort. She filed a formal complaint with the city's code enforcement, making numerous false allegations about my property, including unpermitted modifications and commercial activities. The complaint was lodged on a Monday, with the inspection set for Friday. Friday was the day of Miguel's graduation party. I had organized a small gathering for about 20 relatives, aunts, uncles, and cousins who were traveling from various parts of Texas to honor Miguel's upcoming journey to engineering school. Sarah would have been overjoyed to see our family united like this, watching Miguel radiate with pride as he discussed his college ambitions. Karen was aware of the party. The entire neighborhood was. That was precisely why she had arranged for the inspection to happen during our family event. At 2 p.m., just as Miguel was about to slice into his graduation cake, a city code enforcement vehicle pulled up to my house. Trailing it was Karen's car. She had arrived to witness the spectacle, anticipating that violations would be discovered in the presence of my whole extended family. The inspector, a seasoned man named Bob who seemed as though he would prefer to be anywhere else, got out with his clipboard and camera. "I apologize for interrupting your celebration, sir. I've received a complaint regarding unpermitted modifications and overcrowding infractions. 20 years in construction law had readied me for this very moment." I went inside my house and came back with a banker's box filled with documents. The original architectural blueprints, every single permit issued by the city, inspection certificates, and even the final occupancy letter. "Here are all the permits and inspection reports for this property," I informed Bob, placing the box on my porch table. Please feel free to check the actual construction against the approved plans. Miguel, bless his heart, had taken out his phone and begun to live stream the entire inspection on Instagram. Folks, you are not going to believe this, he told his followers. Some woman reported my uncle's graduation party to code enforcement. The inspection took 2 hours. Bob examined electrical sockets, measured room sizes, inspected plumbing fixtures, and even went up into the attic to check the HVAC system. All the while, Karen stayed close by, occasionally pointing out areas where he might want to search more thoroughly for violations. Here's another legal fact. When an individual lodges false code enforcement complaints, they can be held responsible for the expenses of the unneeded inspections. The key lesson is that baseless complaints frequently rebound when the property is, in fact, fully compliant. As Bob conducted his inspection, neighbors began to congregate. Mrs. Chun brought lemonade for my family. The Johnsons offered their children's assistance in cleaning up party decorations. Even some of Karen's usual allies appeared uneasy with the scene she was causing. Miguel's live stream was attracting more viewers by the minute. Comments came in from his high school friends, college classmates, and even strangers who had happened upon the stream. "This woman is unhinged," one comment stated. "Sue her," another advised. The decisive moment occurred when Bob concluded his inspection. No violations. 0. My house surpassed all code requirements. I had ensured this during the construction phase. Knowing my legal background would make me a prime target for this type of harassment. Bob looked genuinely mortified as he went over to Karen. "Ma'am, I am not sure who provided you with this information, but this property is in perfect compliance. In fact, it's one of the most well-built houses I've inspected this year." It was then that Karen made her most significant error to date. Instead of graciously acknowledging the outcome, she began to argue publicly with the inspector. "You must look more closely," she demanded, her voice escalating. "Recheck the garage. Examine the pool equipment. There must be violations." The live stream documented everything. Karen's increasingly erratic demeanor, her insistence that the inspector discover something, and her clear disappointment when her plan fell apart. Miguel's comment section lit up with viewers sharing their own HOA horror stories. But here is what Karen was unaware of. During the inspection, my construction trained I had caught something that would alter the entire situation. The original architectural plans that Bob was using for comparison with my house revealed major inconsistencies with the community amenities. The specifications for the pool installation did not align with what had actually been constructed. The dimensions of the community center were incorrect. The budget for landscaping appeared to be excessively high compared to what had been implemented. As our family gathering went on into the evening, despite Karen's determined efforts to spoil it, Maria Santos came over to me near the grill where I was preparing burgers for my cousins. "Dave," she said in a hushed tone, "after witnessing this inspection spectacle, I believe you should see the remaining financial records. There's a piece of irrefutable evidence in those construction contracts that will completely astound you." That night, after the last relative had departed and Miguel was fast asleep, worn out from his eventful day, I sat at my kitchen table with Maria's latest collection of documents. What I discovered sent a chill down my construction lawyer's spine. The HOA had been invoiced $2,100,000 for community amenities that had, in reality, cost only $1,400,000 to construct. A sum of $700,000 had simply disappeared, and Karen Mitchell Realty had been a party to every single transaction. It was time to shift from defense to offense. The irrefutable evidence was concealed in plain view, located within a series of emails that Maria had been discreetly archiving for 3 years. "I wasn't certain what I was observing until you brought up the construction inconsistencies," Maria stated as we convened in my kitchen the following morning, with financial records spread across the table like clues in a major investigation. "But examine this." She presented me with a printed email correspondence between Karen and the original developer, Sunset Construction. The subject line was, "Revised Community Amenity Pricing, Confidential." My construction lawyer's mind began to connect the pieces more rapidly than a supercomputer. The initial HOA budget allocated $2,100,000 for community amenities, which included the pool, landscaping, community center, and playground. However, the actual construction invoices, the ones concealed in Maria's files, indicated costs of only $1,400,000. A total of $700,000 was missing. And here is the most revealing part, Maria added, presenting bank statements. Observe Karen's personal account deposits during the construction period. There are large, sporadic deposits, with amounts that happen to align with the timing of HOA payments to the developer. Karen Mitchell Realty had been granted referral bonuses and sales incentives that were 400% higher than standard real estate commission rates. However, the true smoking gun was an email Karen believed she had erased, in which she explicitly discussed profit-sharing arrangements with Sunset Construction for inflated amenity budgets that would be absorbed by HOA dues over time. Here is a financial fact that will surely provoke anger. Developers frequently overstate the costs of community amenities and share the excess profits with insiders who oversee the approval procedures. The key lesson is to always insist on seeing the actual construction invoices, not just budget estimates, before giving approval for HOA special assessments. This was no longer just about access to the pool. It was about methodical financial fraud that had been draining our community's resources for 3 years. Every homeowner had been overcharged for subpar amenities, and we were still overpaying through inflated HOA dues that were intended to conceal the missing funds. And there's more, Maria stated with a serious expression. The monthly landscaping contract, the pool maintenance, and even the snow removal service, they are all overpriced by 30 to 40%, and Karen receives kickbacks from each vendor. The scheme was evident. Karen's zealous enforcement of rules was not about upholding standards. It was about deflecting attention from the financial malfeasance that was enriching her. Her campaign of harassment against me had intensified because my background in construction law made me the one individual in the community with the skills to expose her operation. "Why didn't you present this to the board before?" I inquired. Maria let out a sigh. "Because Karen has control over the board. Jim Walsh is a man of integrity, but is consistently outvoted. The rest are either intimidated by her or gain from her influence. I needed someone with the legal knowledge to grasp what we were dealing with." The irony was exquisite. Karen's efforts to muzzle me had, in fact, spurred me to probe the very financial corruption she was attempting to conceal. Her campaign of harassment served as proof of obstruction, and her discriminatory enforcement practices revealed a deliberate strategy of targeting anyone who might challenge her power. As a construction lawyer, I had encountered this kind of fraud on numerous occasions. Developers and their internal collaborators inflating expenses, pocketing the profits, and then employing aggressive methods to thwart detection. The distinction was that this time, I wasn't being compensated for my investigation. This was a personal matter. "What is our next step?" Maria questioned. I surveyed the evidence laid out on my table. Email confessions of profit sharing, bank records indicating questionable deposits, construction invoices demonstrating cost inflation, and a 3-year history of financial irregularities amounting to over $700,000. "We are going to provide the community with the very thing Karen has been trying to obstruct," I declared, "complete financial transparency. Every homeowner has a right to know where their funds have gone and who has benefited from overcharging them. And if she attempts to hinder us," I added with a smile, feeling more like my former lawyer self than I had since Sarah's passing, "then she will be adding obstruction of justice to the charges of fraud and embezzlement." Karen had chosen the wrong retired construction attorney to confront. It was time to construct a case that would be prosecutable in criminal court. To build a criminal fraud case, one needs 3 elements: evidence, allies, and patience. Fortunately for me, I had spent 2 decades mastering all 3. The first step was to gather the team. Maria Santos provided access to financial records and insider information. Jim Walsh offered the legitimacy of the board and moral high ground. I brought 20 years of expertise in construction law and a deep understanding of how fraudulent schemes are executed. Our initial strategy meeting took place in my living room on a Tuesday night. Security cameras guaranteed our privacy as we laid out documents on my coffee table, much like generals formulating a battle plan. The aroma of Maria's homemade tamales blended with the palpable tension in the air. Nothing fosters a sense of conspiracy quite like a hearty meal. "Here is the situation we are facing," I started, gesturing to the financial timeline I had created. "This is not a case of random pilfering. It's a complex, long-running embezzlement operation with three main sources of income: inflated construction expenses, overpriced service agreements, and developer kickbacks presented as sales commissions. Jim Walsh shook his head, looking stunned. $700,000. That amounts to nearly $6,000 per household. Actually, Maria interjected, it's even worse. The continuous overcharges mean we are being systematically robbed each month through inflated dues and service contracts. Here is a legal insight that could save you a significant amount of money. HOA board members have a fiduciary responsibility to safeguard the community's financial well-being, and residents possess the legal right to access detailed financial records and request independent audits. The key lesson is that if your HOA is unwilling to furnish transparent financial documentation, it is likely because they have something of value to conceal. Our approach was multifaceted: a criminal referral to the district attorney's office for fraud and embezzlement, a civil lawsuit to reclaim the stolen money plus damages, and a reform of the HOA's governance to thwart future corruption. Most crucially, we aim to educate the community so that residents would be aware of their rights and could defend themselves. The essential thing, I explained, is to construct a flawless case before Karen becomes aware of our actions. We must document everything, secure all evidence, and be ready for her certain retaliation. The second step was evidence preservation. I instructed Maria on how to use professional case management software to catalog financial documents. Every questionable transaction, every overpriced agreement, and every suspicious deposit was cross-indexed and time-stamped with supporting evidence. In the meantime, Miguel had taken on the role of our social media intelligence gatherer. That young man's proficiency as a digital native was crucial for monitoring Karen's online presence and gauging the mood of the community. It turned out that Karen's social media posts about upholding standards and dealing with problematic residents had created a perfect timeline of harassment that directly corresponded with my financial findings. Uncle Dave, Miguel remarked one evening while he was organizing our digital evidence, Karen has been posting about you on Facebook almost every day. She's essentially building her own case for obstruction. The third step was legal preparation. I hired Sarah Chun, a criminal defense lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime, not for my own defense, but because I needed an expert who knew prosecutorial tactics and could assist me in presenting the evidence in a way that prosecutors find most effective. This is actually a very solid case, Sarah informed me after she had examined our evidence package. There's financial fraud, mail fraud, and conspiracy to defraud. The email confessions by themselves are a prosecutor's dream. When you add the pattern of retaliation against whistleblowers, you're looking at potential federal charges. The strategy was beautifully straightforward. We submitted official public records requests for all HOA financial documents, a completely legal action that was entirely within our rights as residents. Karen would be forced to either comply, thereby providing us with official proof of the fraud, or to obstruct, which would add criminal charges to her expanding list of legal troubles. The fourth step was community preparation. Jim Walsh leveraged his role as president to call a special board meeting to address financial transparency and community issues. The agenda was presented in a non-threatening manner, but the underlying message was clear: we were taking the battle public. I dedicated my evenings to creating presentation materials that would make complex financial fraud understandable to residents who lacked legal or accounting expertise. These included charts illustrating where their money had gone, comparisons between their payments and what they received, and straightforward explanations of their legal rights to financial information. The objective is not to overwhelm them with technicalities, I told our team. It is to demonstrate how they have been swindled and what actions we can take. Maria took charge of the financial forensics, establishing a paper trail that would be highly valued by prosecutors. Every inflated invoice, every questionable payment, and every kickback disguised as a legitimate business cost was documented with professional accounting accuracy. Concurrently, I was developing the legal framework. Texas has robust laws that protect HOA residents from financial exploitation, yet most people are unaware of their rights. I had drafted template letters that residents could use to request financial transparency, clarified their rights to independent audits, and detailed the legal options available to victims of fraud. The brilliance of our plan was that every step was entirely lawful and within our rights as residents. Karen could attempt to fight back, but she would be contending with residents who were exercising their legitimate authority to oversee community finances. By the time we were prepared to make our case public, we possessed enough evidence to fulfill a federal prosecutor's every wish and sufficient community backing to ensure that Karen could not use intimidation to silence us. The question was no longer whether we could demonstrate Karen's guilt. It was about the length of her potential prison sentence. Karen's desperation became apparent the instant our public records requests landed on her desk. Within 48 hours, she had convened an emergency board meeting to put forward disruptive resident removal procedures, with me as the clear target. Her fabricated story was almost impressive in its boldness. According to Karen, I was a mentally unstable widower who was using his legal expertise to harass dedicated volunteers and endanger the harmony of the community. She went so far as to claim that my grief over Sarah's death had rendered me paranoid and vengeful. The smear campaign spread rapidly across social media. Fabricated Facebook posts alleged that I was intending to sue individual homeowners. Whispering campaigns were initiated about my supposed unstable mental condition following my wife's passing. Fear-mongering tactics suggested that my harassment would lead to higher insurance premiums for all residents. However, Karen's most masterful move was her use of cultural dog whistles, subtle remarks about certain residents not aligning with community values and the importance of preserving our way of life. She was too clever to say anything overtly discriminatory, but the message was clear to anyone paying attention. This is where my legal background proved invaluable. Rather than engaging with the personal attacks, I persisted in the methodical collection of evidence, while also documenting every single one of Karen's statements. 20 years in construction law had shown me that bullies invariably escalate their tactics when their initial efforts are unsuccessful, and escalation always results in errors. The board meeting she convened was so full that it was standing room only. News of the disruptive resident agenda had circulated, and everyone was eager to witness the confrontation. The air was thick with a mixture of nervous perspiration and industrial-strength coffee, creating an atmosphere so dense you could almost slice it with a knife. Karen's presentation featured a formal proposal to establish penalties for disruptive behavior, including fines of up to $1,000 for residents who undermine community harmony through frivolous complaints or intimidation of volunteers. After she concluded, I rose to my feet, holding my manila folder. Before the board deliberates on any penalties, I stated calmly, I would like to raise some issues regarding procedural violations in the format of tonight's meeting. I systematically explained how Karen's proposed penalties were in breach of due process rights under the Texas Property Code, how the emergency meeting violated bylaws that mandate 7 days' notice for policy amendments, and how the term disruptive behavior was unconstitutionally ambiguous and could be used to suppress any resident who challenged board decisions. More significantly, I added, opening my folder, I have documented proof of a 3-year pattern of harassment aimed at residents who ask for financial transparency. The room fell completely silent as I displayed time-stamped records of Karen's harassment campaign, her drive-by photo sessions, her intimidation of my guests, and her attempts to use code enforcement against my family during a gathering. Jim Walsh and Maria Santos vocally endorsed my stance, showing that the board's solidarity Karen had relied on was beginning to crumble. 3 other board members looked visibly uneasy as they grasped that they were being recorded while making decisions driven by personal animosities rather than the community's best interests. It was at this moment that Karen made her most critical mistake. Feeling cornered and on the verge of being exposed, she lost her cool. "This is precisely what I am referring to," she exclaimed. "Mr. Martinez is employing lawyerly intimidation tactics to silence board members who are trying to safeguard this community from individuals who fail to grasp our standards." I simply continued to record, letting her seal her own fate. Following the meeting, where Karen's proposals were rejected by a 5-2 vote, she confronted me in the parking lot. What she was unaware of was that my phone was still recording. "Listen, Dave," she began, her tone saturated with feigned concern. "Perhaps we can resolve our issues. The HOA budget has a degree of flexibility. We could arrange for your pool maintenance to be taken care of, and maybe assist with some landscaping expenses if you would just retract these complaints and allow the board to manage matters discreetly. An attempted bribe, captured on audio, in the presence of witnesses. That is a very generous proposition, Karen. I responded with care. But I believe that financial transparency is beneficial to the entire community, not just to certain individuals. Her composure completely vanished. If you fail to cease your actions, you will come to regret it. This community has methods for handling troublemakers, and my husband has influential contacts in the city government who do not look kindly on residents who squander municipal resources with baseless complaints. A threat, also recorded. The following morning, Karen lodged a false police report, alleging that I had threatened her during our conversation in the parking lot. She timed the complaint flawlessly, right as I was enjoying my morning coffee, to guarantee maximum neighborhood exposure when the police cars showed up. However, Karen had at last made the error I had been anticipating. She had manipulated law enforcement with a demonstrably false claim, and I possessed the audio evidence to prove it. When the officers came to my door at 6 a.m., I was prepared with my phone, the recording of the previous night's exchange, and 2 decades of experience in dealing with individuals who believe that connections can trump evidence. Officers, I stated calmly, I presume you are here regarding a complaint from Karen Mitchell. Before we go any further, I would like you to listen to the actual conversation she is referring to. Karen's overconfidence had just provided me with federal charges for filing false police reports and obstruction of justice. The police officers listened to my recording with expressions that changed from doubt to astonishment and finally to barely concealed frustration. Nothing irritates law enforcement more than having their time and resources exploited for personal grudges. Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez said to Karen when they spoke with her, lodging false reports is a criminal act. We strongly recommend that you rethink any future complaints unless you possess genuine proof of criminal behavior. However, Karen was past the point of reason. Confronted with the exposure of her financial misdeeds and the crumbling of her community influence, she went into a full-on scorched earth offensive. Her ultimate desperate move was to file a formal complaint with the city attorney's office, asserting that I was a threat to community safety and was employing legal intimidation to subvert lawful governance. She tried to have the HOA accounts frozen to block my access to financial records, using ongoing legal threats as her reason. When that was unsuccessful, she called for emergency no-confidence votes against Jim Walsh and Maria Santos, alleging they had been swayed by the troublemaker. Her aim was to put a compliant board in place before the criminal inquiry could move forward. The community began to split along expected lines. Newer residents, cowed by the possibility of legal expenses and subscribing to the idea that authority should be respected, supported Karen's story about maintaining stability. In contrast, original homeowners, families who had directly faced her harassment, and anyone who valued financial transparency backed our efforts for openness. The majority, however, simply wished for the conflict to be over, regardless of who was in the right. It was then that the local media's interest turned our neighborhood dispute into a matter of public concern. Channel 8 News acquired Miguel's viral live stream video and started an investigation into the abuse of power by HOAs in suburban areas. Suddenly, our small Willowbrook affair was emblematic of a larger issue of unchecked power in residential management. While Karen was occupied with damage control interviews, I was submitting a detailed criminal complaint to the district attorney's office. 20 years in construction law had taught me precisely how prosecutors operate, and I organized our evidence in their preferred format: a timeline, financial documentation, recorded confessions, and a pattern of obstruction. The DA's white-collar crime division put Detective Sarah Chun on the case. Within 48 hours, she had served subpoenas for all HOA financial records, developer contracts, and Karen's personal banking details dating back 5 years. This is significant, Detective Chun informed me during our meeting. We have financial fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and now obstruction of justice. We could be looking at federal charges. Karen's alarm was evident to the entire community. For the first time, she was facing repercussions that went beyond neighborhood disputes. Her real estate license was being reviewed. Her husband's position on the city council was attracting negative attention. Criminal defense lawyers are expensive, and her ill-gotten gains were on the verge of being seized as evidence. But a cornered animal is a dangerous one, and Karen had one final move to make: property damage. My pool equipment mysteriously failed, resulting in $3,000 worth of damage to pumps and filtration systems. Security cameras were tampered with, but not before they captured video of late-night visitors on my property. My home office window was shattered by a stray baseball that had somehow flown 200 yards from the nearest sports field. The campaign of harassment extended to my professional standing. There were organized calls to my old law firm, claiming I was experiencing a mental breakdown and issuing threats against community members. Letters were sent to the state bar, implying I was misusing my law license to intimidate private citizens. Karen's last power move was to call for an emergency vote to oust the current HOA board and bring in a professional management company that, coincidentally, was owned by one of her real estate contacts. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. The sheer volume of evidence was now too great to be suppressed. Security footage had recorded her late-night acts of sabotage. Phone records proved the coordinated harassment campaign. Most damning of all, Detective Chin's investigation had brought to light other kickback arrangements involving landscaping, pool maintenance, and snow removal services. The community education initiative we had started was proving effective. 47 residents endorsed a petition calling for financial transparency. Local news reports had informed homeowners of their rights regarding HOA financial records. Property law blogs and HOA reform websites were highlighting our case as a prime example of community action. Regional television news covered the story as an instance of suburban corruption, with interviews from HOA law experts who clarified residents' rights and legal options. Miguel's documentation of Karen's actions had reached far beyond our local area, motivating other HOA residents to seek accountability. The viral nature of the story added a level of pressure Karen had not foreseen. Her conduct was now a matter of public record, stored on social media and news sites. Any potential real estate clients could now simply Google her name and find comprehensive proof of harassment, financial fraud, and abuse of power. As Detective Chin's inquiry broadened to include federal mail fraud charges, Karen saw that her comfortable suburban fiefdom was crumbling. The mandatory community meeting, required by state law when criminal investigations touch on HOA finances, was set for the following Saturday. All interested parties were to be there: residents, media, law enforcement, Karen's criminal defense lawyer, and a highly prepared construction attorney with nothing more to lose and a community to safeguard. It was time for the decisive confrontation. Saturday morning broke with the sharp anticipation of a courtroom just before a verdict is announced. The gymnasium of Willowbrook Elementary School, our community center being too small for the crowd this story had drawn, was packed. 89 of our 127 households were present, along with Channel 8 News, Detective Sarah Chun, Karen's criminal defense attorney, and enough social media live streams to overload the school's Wi-Fi. The air was a mixture of industrial disinfectant, nervous perspiration, and high expectation. Folding chairs, set in orderly rows, were directed at a table where Karen sat beside her lawyer, looking as though she had aged 5 years in the last month. Maria, Jim, and I held the opposite side, our boxes of evidence piled up like legal fortifications. Karen's initial move was just as expected. She played the victim. Her lawyer had prepared her thoroughly. She spoke in controlled tones about being unfairly targeted for her volunteer efforts to uphold community standards and being harassed by a man who refuses to acknowledge legitimate authority. Mr. Martinez has employed his legal knowledge to intimidate dedicated volunteers, she stated, careful not to make eye contact with the cameras. This witch hunt is costing our community thousands in legal expenses and is tearing apart the harmony we have strived to create. She depicted herself as a committed public servant who had been singled out by an unstable widower using legal maneuvering to resolve personal vendettas. It was a convincing act, provided one chose to ignore the mountain of evidence just 3 feet away. When Karen concluded, I rose and linked my laptop to the school's projection system. 2 decades of courtroom presentations had taught me that visual proof invariably outweighs emotional arguments. Before we get into personality clashes, I started, let's examine some figures. The first slide displayed our community's initial construction budget, $2,100,000 for amenities. The subsequent slide showed the actual construction expenses, $1,400,000. The discrepancy, $700,000, was highlighted in red. This sum represents funds our community was charged for amenities that were never delivered, I clarified. That amounts to nearly $6,000 per household that disappeared during the construction period. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Numbers are impartial, and these figures were revealing a story Karen desperately wanted to keep hidden. The following slides detailed the continuous overpayments. Pool maintenance agreements at 40% above the market average, landscaping services that cost 3 times as much as similar providers, and snow removal contracts for a Texas community that sees, on average, 1 snow day every 10 years. Every month, your HOA dues are inflated to cover these substandard services, I went on. Over a period of 3 years, this has resulted in an additional theft of roughly $200,000. But the irrefutable proof was in the email evidence. Maria had saved Karen's digital confession, and now it was projected onto the gymnasium screen in 24-point font. Revised community amenity pricing, confidential, and profit-sharing arrangements for inflated amenity budgets. You could have heard a pin drop. The residents were now seeing, in Karen's own words, how she had plotted to steal from the very community she professed to be safeguarding. This is not a matter of a personality clash, I stated firmly. This is documented financial fraud. It was at this point that Karen's composure finally broke. Disregarding her attorney's frantic gestures, she stood up and began to defend herself. "Those emails have been taken out of context," she yelled. "I secured the best possible deals for this community. If Dave Martinez weren't so fixated on ruining me because I enforced pool rules against his nephew, none of this would be happening." A ripple of unease went through the crowd. She had just confessed to targeting Miguel due to his ethnicity while also acknowledging the financial discrepancies. "I have dedicated 3 years of my life to safeguarding property values and upholding standards," Karen persisted, her voice escalating. "If that requires preventing certain elements from threatening what we have established here, then I will not apologize." The racist implications were now undeniable. All around the room, phones were raised to record her public breakdown. Miguel, seated in the front row, simply shook his head in disappointment while live-streaming to his thousands of followers. Detective Chun selected that moment to speak to the assembly. "The district attorney's office has brought criminal charges, which include fraud, embezzlement, mail fraud, and conspiracy. This is now an active criminal investigation." Karen's lawyer had to physically hold her back to prevent her from speaking further, but the harm had been done. She had openly admitted to financial wrongdoing while also exposing the discriminatory reasons behind her campaign of harassment. The community's reaction was immediate and unified. One after another, residents stood up to recount their own experiences with Karen's harassment, the financial difficulties brought on by inflated HOA dues, and the stories of families who had left the community rather than be subjected to her targeting. The Johnsons recounted receiving violation notices for suspicious gatherings when their extended family came to visit for the holidays. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman from across the street, delivered the final, decisive blow. "In my 60 years, I have never witnessed anyone put so much effort into demolishing the very sense of community they claim to be protecting." The standing ovation that followed our presentation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Not for me, but for the truth finally being revealed and for justice being within reach. "I did not come to Willowbrook to practice law again," I stated once the crowd had settled. "I came here to find peace. But when someone attempts to steal from my community and then harasses families for simply asking questions, they chose the wrong retired construction attorney." It was the dramatic conclusion Karen had orchestrated, just not in the way she had envisioned. 6 months later, justice had found a beautiful sense of balance. Karen Mitchell entered a guilty plea to federal fraud charges, consenting to complete restitution and penalties to avoid a trial. The total sum came to $847,000 in stolen money, plus interest and legal costs. Her real estate license was permanently taken away, and her husband discreetly stepped down from the city council after his own part in the cover-up was revealed. Sunset Construction came under federal investigation and was barred from all municipal contracts. 3 other communities uncovered similar kickback arrangements, transforming our local issue into a statewide movement for HOA reform. However, The true success was what we constructed from the remnants of Karen's corrupt reign. Our new HOA bylaws mandate transparent financial disclosure, resident oversight committees, and independent audits. There are no more secret agreements or unexplained budget entries. Any expense exceeding $500 requires board consent with full notification to the community. Maria Santos was voted in as president, Jim Walsh remains as treasurer, and I took on the role of compliance officer, a volunteer capacity that allows me to use my legal expertise for the good of the community. The recovered money turned Willowbrook from Karen's oppressive fiefdom into the cooperative community we had all envisioned. We allocated $400,000 to suspend HOA dues for 3 years. An additional $300,000 was used for real enhancements, updated playgrounds, new walking paths, and a community garden that now supplies fresh produce to the local food bank. The final $147,000 was used to create the Sarah Martinez Memorial Scholarship for local students studying engineering. Miguel was the first to receive the scholarship, and seeing him accept the award with tears in his eyes served as a powerful reminder of why the pursuit of justice is so important. Sarah would have been delighted to see her legacy helping other young individuals achieve their aspirations. The personal healing was what took me most by surprise. Confronting Karen's corruption had provided me with a sense of purpose that extended beyond my grief. It was a means to apply 2 decades of legal knowledge to safeguard people, not just to win legal battles. The community meetings that once had the feel of a trial are now centered on shared initiatives and genuine cooperation. Miguel dedicated his last weeks of summer to setting up pool parties for the neighborhood children, teaching them to swim and demonstrating that community facilities are for everyone. The sound of children's laughter in that pool, the very one Karen had attempted to use as a weapon, became the anthem of our triumph. Our tale extended beyond the confines of Willowbrook. Property law publications highlighted our case as a blueprint for community action. State lawmakers referenced our situation when they were creating bills for HOA reform. I began to get calls from other communities facing similar corruption, and assisting them felt like the most meaningful way to spend my retirement. The ripple effects are still spreading. Real estate agents now make it a point to inform potential buyers about their rights to HOA financial oversight. Municipal regulations now mandate more rigorous supervision of community financial affairs. Most importantly, residents in developments all over Texas are now aware that they possess power when they unite with facts and legal standing on their side. Karen's harassment was intended to create isolation and fear, but it achieved the very opposite. Our community became more resilient, more unified, and more watchful in safeguarding one another from any future mistreatment. The dread she had fostered was superseded by the assurance that comes from confronting bullies and emerging victorious. Detective Chun informed me that our case had become a model for teaching how to conduct white-collar crime investigations. Most HOA fraud is never brought to light because residents are unaware of their rights, she noted. Your thorough documentation and clear presentation made the prosecution a simple matter. Last month, we hosted our inaugural annual community pool party, paying tribute to Sarah's memory and commemorating our transition from autocratic rule to cooperative governance. Families from all over Willowbrook came together around the pool that had been the origin of this entire dispute, sharing food, recounting stories, and relishing the gratification of seeing justice prevail. Miguel, who is now excelling in his engineering studies, came to join the festivities. "Uncle Dave," he remarked, as we observed neighbors enjoying themselves, laughing and swimming together, "Aunt Sarah would be incredibly proud of what you have accomplished here." He was correct. We had created something Sarah would have cherished, a community founded on principles of fairness, openness, and mutual regard, rather than on fear and control. Many can relate to such horror stories with their own HOAs, and sharing these experiences can often empower others to defend their rights. It is a reminder that there is more power in the hands of everyday people than corrupt officials would have you believe. By researching your rights, documenting everything, and refusing to be silenced by bullying, real change is possible. Sometimes, the most effective form of justice is simply choosing not to stay quiet when you are aware of what is right.